My one-year review of the Ski-Doo Expedition Sport 600 EFI sparked some discussion about the 600 EFI engine overheating, especially when mated to the Expedition's 154-inch track with 1.5-inch paddles. The 600 EFI engine is liquid-cooled. The heat exchanger is located in the tunnel under the seat. The idea is simple. The track spits loose snow up into the tunnel, which cools the coolant in the heat exchanger, which is then pumped into the engine. Warm coolant from the engine is obviously pumped into the heat exchanger to cool. The more powder the heat exchanger gets, the cooler the engine temperature. When running on roads, ice, or other surfaces with little or no snow, the heat exchanger loses its ability to cool the coolant, and the engine can overheat. Last season, I did have a few instances where my Expedition Sport 600 EFI engine overheated. 3 to be specific. The first 2 were very early in my ownership experience, and both occurred while road running, where the Ski-Doo had no powder whatsoever with which to cool itself. The third occurred after running several hours on a very low snow, packed and groomed trail. At that point, I installed ice scratchers, and I haven't had a problem since. This video is intended to demonstrate how far the Expedition Sport 600 EFI can go on roads and low snow trails, with no heat management actions whatsoever on the rider's part. This means no ice scratchers, no diving into powder on the side of the trail to cool the engine. Just run the trails until I get a temperature warning on the dash. So I plotted a 90-kilometer route along packed and groomed trails, including some road running. Many of you are aware that Ski-Doo recalled the 2021 600 EFI models due to a heat-related problem. The recall involved replacing the vent above the muffler and an ECU reflash. The replacement vent has some heat shielding applied to the engine side. My dealer couldn't shed much light on the new ECU parameters, but I'd assume they've optimized the ECU for thermal management. The recall has been performed on this Expedition Sport. For this video, my route included 6 kilometers or just under 4 miles of road running, 17 kilometers or about 10 miles on frozen lakes, with the balance of the 90 kilometers or 55-mile route on groomed, packed, low snow trails. Trails had so little snow that dirt and gravel could be seen in places. Roads and some sections of trail had to be handled at very low speeds of 20 to 30 kilometers per hour, which is about 15 miles per hour. Which isn't optimal for cooling because the track isn't spitting enough snow into the heat exchanger at those speeds. Most trails were navigated at 50 to 60 kilometers per hour, which is about 35 miles per hour, and lakes were crossed at up to 120 kilometers per hour, or 75 miles per hour, speeds which put the 600 EFI engine under maximum load for extended periods. The ride was done as continuously as possible, stopping only to move the cameras and to provide some trail-side assistance to an SUV driver towards the end of the trip, which you'll see in this video. Since my camera batteries won't last long enough for a 2-hour trip at 10 degrees below freezing, I kept the cameras off and warm until the 30-kilometer mark, at which point the engine had reached about 44 degrees Celsius, which is about 110 Fahrenheit. The gauge cluster conveniently displays engine temperature in a bar graph along the right edge of the display. Additionally, I've configured my display to show the precise metric engine temperature measurement in the bottom right corner of the display. The overheat warning isn't triggered until about 90 degrees Celsius or 184 Fahrenheit, so 44 Celsius is a pretty low engine temperature, and you can see that the bar graph on the right hasn't even reached the halfway point. At this point in the trip, the peak temperature observed had been 57 degrees Celsius or 135 Fahrenheit while road running. Now back on the trail, we can see that the Expedition has cooled itself considerably to 44. Here we see trail conditions with patches of gravel and dirt showing through the trail. There's less than 1 inch of snow on this trail, and still, the 600 EFI isn't even breaking 50 degrees Celsius. Now, on a frozen lake, we have a chance to put some real load on the engine. Here I'm running at 90 to 100% throttle, reaching speeds of 120, even 125 kilometers per hour, or about 78 miles per hour. Engine temperature remains low, peaking at 46 degrees, even during sustained wide-open throttle on ice. Again, this is without using ice scratchers. Heading back into Garson at reasonable speeds on the beautiful and scenic sea trail, temperatures crept up to just a bit over 50 degrees. Some fellow riders asked me to show them a path through Garson, so I'll admit I briefly deployed my ice scratchers through town, which was about 3 kilometers, or about 2 miles, to make sure we didn't have any surprises, and we didn't. Except, as we were about to rejoin the trail, we were flagged down by a man who got his SUV stuck on a snowmobile path. We advised this stranded motorist against testing his Nissan's off-road chops on a skidoo path in the future. Then we gave him a solid push to get him back onto the roadway. The grateful driver offered to buy us some beer in thanks, and while the offer was appreciated, I declined in favor of getting myself home. With the trip completed, I covered 90.7 kilometers or 56.3 miles in just over 2 hours. I rode in the worst-case conditions for cooling a snowmobile, including low snow, groomed and packed trails, roads, and frozen lakes. The 600 EFI did it all in a nearly continuous run without even reaching an engine temperature of 60 degrees Celsius, which is 30 degrees below the overheat warning set point. During another ride, I was able to film the effectiveness of cooling the snowmobile by picking up some powder. Driving into powder is an extremely effective method of cooling the snowmobile. Here you can see that running on packed trail has my engine at 58 degrees Celsius. When I encounter a frozen marsh, without leaving the bounds of the trail, without trespassing on other people's property, I'm able to ride the right edge of the trail to pick up a bit of snow and put some powder into the heat exchanger. The engine temperature starts dropping within 5 seconds, and after only 20 seconds of riding powder, the engine temperature is cooled down to 46 degrees Celsius. Should you reach an engine coolant temperature of 90 degrees Celsius, your gauge cluster will light up with a red temperature indicator and beep loudly. You can't miss it. If this occurs and there's powder nearby, drive directly into the powder. If possible, blip the throttle a few times to spin the track, flinging cold snow onto that heat exchanger. If you can do this, the beeping will stop and the red light will go out within 5 to 10 seconds. If there's no powder around, then pull over and shut off your engine. Pack snow on top of the tunnel until it stops melting. You can even fling snow up into the tunnel by hand if you want. Then, restart your engine. Remember, by packing snow on the heat exchanger, you've only cooled the coolant in the heat exchanger, not the coolant in the engine. The coolant in the engine is still hot. So your alarm will sound when you start the engine, but if you let it run for 5 or 10 seconds, the coolant pump will pump the cold coolant from your heat exchanger into the engine, then the temperature will drop and the alarm will stop. So, does the 600 EFI overheat? Well, it's possible, and indeed I've seen it happen, but it's an unusual occurrence and not something you should worry about. The recent ECU reflash may have completely eliminated the problem, but it can't hurt to have a set of ice scratchers installed. They're cheap and they'll shave 10 degrees off your engine temperature within seconds of being deployed.